Pastor Ken was talking about the people of the area coming and watching and thanking him. I can still recall a project we were doing down in the little village of Farmersville. We were putting new water lines in, and we had to go over top of a 24-inch high-pressure gas line. It was buried 7 feet in the ground. But on the evening, we had to do it at night, and when we started the project, there had to be helicopters flying overhead and emergency personnel on hand. And we told the people of the residents, you need to stay away. But middle of the night, here someone started a bonfire, and no, it was a good bonfire, and they brought us hot dogs and chili and coffee and hot chocolate, and they said, once we got out of there for our lunch, we said, you're not supposed to be here, and they said, well, we got to. This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened in this town. So it went well. I know we are a couple weeks past Christmas, but there's a lot of information that I gleaned out of this individual that I really thought should be shared with all of us because I had no idea that they were going on. And there are several arduous journeys, tough journeys, let's say, at the heart of the Christmas story. Mary and Joseph traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The Magi traveled to Nazareth from the east. Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Egypt to avoid the wrath of Herod. And I understand this lady who wrote this, her name is Nicole DePoole, said, I understand and to realize the physical challenge that they had to go through to do these trips. I speak, she says, from the full track going up the Masonic prayer, and I'm sure on the way to Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph prayed all the way. Because these journeys only take up a few of the Bible verses, there is so much left to our imagination. To understand the risk that Mary and Joseph took to bring the Messiah into the world, and the lengths the Magi went just to meet him. So here's some information that I'd like to share with you. Have you ever asked yourself why Mary and Joseph waited until Mary was almost 9 months pregnant before making the 80-mile journey to Bethlehem for the census? Now, you ladies in here who've had children, you know what it's like when you get down to those last couple weeks. I don't, since I don't have kids. The next thing I can compare it to is when we have problems with the calving or pigs or something like that. But why did they not leave sooner? We'll never know for sure, but one of the possibilities is this. Back then, many women died during childbirth. The littlest thing could have terminated her pregnancy. Mary could have gotten a fever. And during the winter season, it's rainy and would have gotten below freezing quite a bit. It would have been very, very dangerous for Mary. And that's why I lean towards not so much the winter, but Joseph would have waited until it was safe to travel, even if that meant Mary was just days away from having a birth. So really, it's unlikely that Mary and Joseph made the trip to Bethlehem in the winter. That's when Jesus was actually born. So when was he actually born? No one knows. Why? Birthdays were considered pagan traditions and weren't celebrated in Jewish or Christian households until much later in history. Eventually, Christianity wanted to cover all the non-Christian holidays by having their own holiday in its place. The winter pagan holiday merged with Christmas. And before Christmas was celebrated on December 25th, it was a Roman holiday celebrating the sun god Medea. Considering the dangers of traveling in the winter, Paul goes on to say, think that Jesus was born in the spring because that explained why Joseph and Mary would have chosen to travel at the end of her third semester. They may have no choice but to wait. It's also talked about in the current hypotheses of among Bible scholars stands that this journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem that Mary and Joseph would have taken and traveled about 90 miles. In 4 days, they averaged 2.5-mile pace for roughly 8 hours a day. That doesn't leave much time for Mary and Joseph to take breaks, to go to the bathroom, cook meals, or catch their breath or even rest. So Nicole said, my Bible scholars, in my experience, are men, she said, and I don't really think they understand what it's like to travel as a pregnant woman in her third trimester. And that's why I ask you girls out here, in today's society, in a car or ambulance is not too bad. But imagine, like Susie said, on a donkey in the wilderness. Aside from the practical problems of not getting to take bathroom breaks and eat food, the 4-day journey implies something else. A 4-day journey would indicate that Joseph may not have cared about Mary. There was no need to rush. So I think Joseph would have taken a slower pace for Mary's sake. He would have polarized her health and her safety. With these things in mind, Paul thinks Mary and Joseph averaged about 2 miles per hour in a 12-mile trip, and so they took a 6-hour day. In total, they estimated that the journey took about a week instead of 4 days. Now, the Jordan River is right there, and it offers plenty of fresh water, edible plants, dates, palms, and also safety from the Samaritans. Paul thinks the two camped close to the river because Mary was pregnant and unmarried. It was not likely that many of their relatives would accept them. So they may not have any other options to stay in villages but along the river to stay healthy and safe. Now, the estimated journey from Jericho to Jerusalem would have taken Mary and Joseph about 2 days because it is ascent the entire way. In other words, we're going uphill. The Dead Sea is the lowest place in the world, and Jerusalem is in the hill country, and it sits on a hill. This is the shortest leg of the journey. It's 5 miles downhill afterwards. They would have passed by the city of David, which lies at the south of Herod's Jerusalem. Now, scholars aren't sure whether Mary traveled to Bethlehem on a donkey or not, but this is a really interesting thing. Paul says she hopes that she was, and he explains this. It's very symbolic. Jesus was in the womb on the donkey when Mary, when they came into Jerusalem, came from the east, which is the same side that Jesus came into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday. They entered into Jerusalem on a donkey from the east at his birth, and they entered from the east on a donkey at his death. It basically creates bookends for Jesus' time and life here. So let's talk about those who came first. We talk about the shepherds. Now, in the class of society today, the shepherds back then were at the lowest of the lowest. Sure, they provided meat and they provided milk. But if those of us who have been around a farm, you know that pigs and cows have their smells. We used to have goats and they were a little different, or chickens. But now sheep are an entirely different breed of animal. If you read in the scriptures how the shepherds used to go through and check their sheep every day to make sure if they didn't have bugs and pestilence, make sure they weren't injured. And sheep's wool, if you've never been around it, is kind of oily, and it doesn't smell real good. So these gentlemen are out there, these shepherds. They're not taking baths very often. They're wandering around and touching and feeling all these sheep, so they really don't smell the best. And that's why people back then really considered them the lowest of the lowest. So why did our God present the birth of our Savior to the lowest of the lowest first? Pastor Ken and I were talking about this. Can you imagine when they were out there and the multitude of angels came upon them? Now, if you go out on a good starry night and you can look from as far as you can look one way to the other, the stars in the Milky Way and the different aspects up there. When I hear the multitude of angels, I don't see one or two. I see endless amount of angels. Either way, brightening up the sky with an immense glow and an immense announcement. Now, these men may not have been the smartest, but would you not think that they would be really surprised and apprehensive and then given the first news? So we ask why. The humbleness of these men at that time were something that Christ and God wanted to show. He was born in a manger, a very humble setting. The first who came to him were not the powers to be at the time, but simple farmers, to show that the humility of humanity was amongst the poor, and to show that Jesus didn't come into the world to be a zealous leader, but to be a humble servant of God for us. The next were the Magi. Now, this has always been a mysterious journey for me. Who were these Magi? We're not exactly sure where they are, where they're from, and how they know how to follow the star to Jesus. We know that they came from the east. Babylon at that time is referred to as the east. Other places in the scripture. Nebuchadnezzar came from the east. The Jew under Daniel went to the east, and the east usually meant Babylon. Well, if you look at the map today, Babylon is not there, but it's really close to Baghdad. And it's always got me wondering about all these things that happened in the Bible in the early days are all held in countries nowadays who are not real good friends of the United States. Most Bible scholars assess that the Magi followed the path that Abraham took from Ur to Canaan. However, DePaul thinks that they went straight to Jerusalem, the modern-day Jordan, because the Magi go a different route home to avoid Herod. So DePaul thinks they returned to Babylon, departing from Nazareth instead of Bethlehem. And although their name sounds like an abbreviation for a magician, they didn't perform tricks or magic. They were diviners, as they called back then. People who looked to the stars to gain perspective. They were astrologists, people who studied the stars. Now, Babylon would be pretty close to the present-day Baghdad, as I said, which means that the Magi would have had to travel 900 miles to Jesus by the time to get to Jerusalem. They weren't looking for an infant. They were looking for a child, not a baby, which implies that they've been traveling for a long time. Now, these gentlemen probably rode on camels, who made a pretty good pace, but they still had to stop for restroom breaks and food and water and rest. So the time period has never been specified how long it took them to get there. It's just one of those mysteries that we are allowed to imagine in our mind what it would be like. We've watched movies on television with Lawrence of Arabia and the things that they had camels, and always interesting. My brother and sister-in-law just came back from Egypt, and one of their pictures of them sitting on a camel, and I asked him how it was. And they said they weren't the most comfortable to sit on. And so when they got there, in the Bible, the Magi found Jesus in a proper house. There were no angels. There were no mangers. So it makes me think that Jesus was already in Nazareth when the Magi came. And another reason why scholars think the Magi found Jesus in Nazareth is because the route they took home was a longer route, because they did not want to go back and talk to Herod. There's a lost manuscript that's been found in the Revelation of the Magi, and it's a Caesarean manuscript. It's translated into English by a scholar named Brett Land. He may help answer the questions of the Christmas story. Who were these Magi? Who were these Magi? They were gift-bearing wise men from the East who are so central to the tradition of telling the Christmas story. I know Susan says she doesn't like to take the Christmas tree until after the Magi's have arrived. And I said, well, you better take it down in August instead of next week. Bible scholars Brent believes that he also found at least one answer to the age-old question. The Bible tells us very, very little about the Magi. Their story appears but once, as Susie read this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, where they're described as mysterious visitors from the East, who came to Jerusalem looking for a child whose star they had observed its rising. Now, it makes sense. These men were astrologists. They look at stars, they see them. What's this bright, shining star more prevalent than the rest of them? Let's go find out. I had an older brother, I still have an older brother, who was really into, back then, starting with his 35mm camera, take pictures of barn fires. Well, you would see the smoke, and you would see some of that, and he said, let's go. It's only down the street. Next thing we know, we're 10 miles down the road, and we still aren't at the fire yet. So I imagine maybe some of the things that the Magi were thinking about was the same thing. Let's go. It's just down the block. 900 miles later, they finally make it to where the child is at. But after meeting with King Herod, who falsifies his intention to worship the child, but actually plans to destroy him, the Magi's follow the same star to Bethlehem. Then upon seeing the baby Jesus and his mother Mary, The Magi knelt down, worshiped him, and presented him with these three gifts, the famous gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And without reporting to Herod, what did they do? They departed for their homeland, never to be heard from again. Maybe. For early Christians, this seemingly pivotal, unexplained background of the mysterious Magi provide an abundant room for our use of our imagination on who were they, where did they come from. One of the most compelling and recent translation in English by a Bible scholar was, like I said, was Brent Land, in his so-called Revelations of a Magi. It's an account of the traditional Christmas story that proposes to have been written by the Magi's themselves. Christmas Day may be December 25th, but it's not the end of the Christmas story. In many Western Christian traditions, there are 12 days of Christmas, as Susie read this morning, culminating around January 6th, known as the Feast of the Epiphany. That's when many believe that the Magi, or the wise men, or the three kings arrived to see the newborn Jesus. But they weren't there. Not yet. While it's difficult to tie their description to many specific people, the very brief description of them in the Gospel of Matthew does not track with understanding of the world at the time. The Gospel was written, thought to be someplace between 70 CE and 85 CE. The only reference to these wise men in the Bible is chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew, and they were called, like I said, wise men or king. There's not also a mention of how many men might have went with them. And my wife Susan says, well, why is that? Well, you're traveling in a convoy of three men. There's a lot of thieves and bandits. Like the American settlers, when they were traveling from the east to the west, they didn't go one Conestoga wagon at a time. They went with a group. Protection, safety. So there might have been 5, there might have been 10, there might have been 100. That information is not known. It only describes some men from the east and visitors from the east. And Matthew's gospel says that soon after Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem in Judea, ruled by Roman King Herod, some men who studied the star from the east of Jerusalem asked, "Where is the baby born to be the King of the Jews? We saw the stars when it came up in the east, and we have come to worship him." This is according to the gospel. That man had followed the star to the house where Jesus and Mary were and presented them with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So what did these three gifts really represent? Gold represents wealth and power. Frankincense was a type of incense and perfume. And myrrh is an outliner, according to Christy Swanson, an associate professor at the Religious Studies of Virginia Commonwealth University. Say that 10 times fast. It's been used as a perfume in ancient Egypt, and it's also an embalming process, in which Christians have interpreted as foreshadowing Jesus' death. In Mark 15, Jesus is offered wine with myrrh before his crucifixion because it's also a painkiller. Myrrh was also used in oils for anointing kings, which is significant since given that the Magi had come looking for the King of the Jews. These luxurious gifts indicate that these visitors from the East are people of great wealth and power, the kind of observed based on the things that they bring. They were called magi in Greek, which is also the term that refers to a kind of a subclass of Persian priest. But they have come to be known as wise men. Their orientation was much more in what we might today identify with science. Looking to stars is very much in keeping with the religious traditions of this place. In time of looking to heaven, the stars and the planets for information about the gods, wishes and doings, and some stars and planets were identified back then as gods. Surprisingly enough, this account is also preserved in the 8th century Syrian manuscript, and it's held in the Vatican Library. Although the researchers believe the earliest version of the text may have been written as early as mid-2nd century, which is just less than 100 years after the Matthew Gospel was composed. It's written in the first person. Now, if you go back to your literature, first person it's written by you personally, not by another person or a ghostwriter. It's written in the first person, and the revelation of the Magi narrates the mystical origin of the Magi, their miraculous encounter with the luminous star, and their equally miraculous journey to Bethlehem to worship the child. The Magi's returned home and preached the Christian faith then to their brethren. And this is interesting, and I really tried and made sure I was telling you correctly. Ultimately, these Magi's were baptized by Thomas, one of Jesus' followers. So now that you know a little bit about the story between what Susie said about the 12 days of Christmas and this little bit of information here, maybe we can stretch the Christmas spirit out just a little bit longer and possibly take this information and tell others that it doesn't just last for a day or a month or a year, but for a lifetime. Thank you.